Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Today is Thursday, January 26, 2023. I'm Dr. Smalls, Director of Professional Development for the Maryland Department of Health's Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to today's DDA Rate Review Advisory Group. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options to hear the webinar, by computer and phone. If you look at the panel interface on your right labeled audio, you can click either computer or phone to switch for the best option for you. There are two handouts for the webinar, which can be downloaded from the handout section, or if you're listening by phone, you can request that they be emailed. We will be recording the webinar and posting this session on the YouTube and DDA website. Today's PowerPoint has also been uploaded as an attachment and is available to you to download in the webinar panel box. Questions can be typed in the question or chat box in the webinar panel, and the DDA and team will review and respond accordingly. And now I'd like to introduce you to Jennifer McIlvaine, Director of Medicaid.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to our first Rate Review Advisory Group meeting of 2023. All of us at the Maryland Department of Health, thank you for your participation and joining us in our second year of this important work for rate review. Can we go to the next slide, please? Today's agenda starts with a presentation from the Hilltop Institute on the general ledger data collection process they've been developing. We'll then have a brief refresher on the rate development process and rate review cycle. After that, I'd like to spend the bulk of our time together discussing fiscal year 2025 rate review priorities. So what will guide our work for the rest of the year. Optimist will guide us through that discussion. And finally, time permitting, we'll have some open discussion before closing with next steps, and that will also include what you can expect for our next meeting on February 9th. Next slide, please. Just a reminder that this advisory group is part of the structure implemented to further MDH's commitment to the development of adequate and sustainable rates that promote the vision and mission of the DDA. Commitment members have made to participate ensures an open and transparent process to review rates. Next slide, please. The DDA is guided by 6 essential focus areas so that people with developmental disabilities will have full lives in their communities where they're included and participate and are active citizens. These focus areas are employment, self-determination, technology, self-advocacy, self-determination, supporting families, and independent living. As we work together on our rate-setting priorities, we ask that we make sure our recommendations are aligned with supporting these focus areas. Next slide, please. A reminder, this 10-member advisory group has a combination of reserves, designated and open seats. 3 seats are reserved for industry representatives, and 1 seat is reserved for a representative of SDAN with experience and expertise with self-directed service budgets and delivery of services. Of the reserved industry seats, 2 are designated for members of the statewide Association of Service Provider Agencies, representing approximately 100 providers, the Maryland Association of Community Services. And there is 1 open seat for a person who brings knowledge and expertise of how policy, rates, and service definitions should align to drive the system. 1 seat for a user of DDA services, and 4 additional open seats for industry representatives. The result is a seated membership which collectively covers the state and covers the full array of services. The providers collectively serve almost 1,500 people, ranging from 77 individuals served to over 350 across provider agencies. This slide displays the names of all currently selected members At this time, I would like to invite the members to introduce themselves. Members of the public are also welcome to introduce themselves through the chat box. Why don't we start at the top of the slide? Laura, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Jennifer. Good morning, everybody. I'm Laura Hell, the Executive Director of the Maryland Association of Community Services, which is a statewide DD provider association in Maryland. Thank you.
All right, and Maria and Sharon, if you're on the line.
Yeah, hi, I'm Maria Dominiak. I'm an actuary with Aram Actuarial Consulting, and I have over 30 years of experience working in Medicaid on rate setting. Sharon?
Good morning, everyone. This is Sharon Lewis. I am a principal at Health Management Associates, and I have about 25 years of working in home and community services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
And Carol? Carol, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sorry, I didn't know I was muted. My name is Carol Custer. I've been a support broker for over 10 years working in self-direction.
And Donna?
Hi, good morning. I'm Donna Retzloff, the Executive Director of Springdale Center, and we're located in Charles County.
And Karen?
Good morning. I'm Karen Adams Gilchrist, the President and CEO of Providence in Anne Arundel County and the Max Board President.
And I believe Matt is not attending today, so we'll go next to Scott.
Good morning, this is Scott Hollingsworth. I'm the Executive Director of Appalachian Crossroads, and we're located in Garrett County.
And Karen?
I'm Karen Lee. I'm the CEO of Speak. We provide supports in the DC metro area in Maryland and DC, and I work with the Department of Labor and ACL, Administration on Community Living, on supporting states through processes just like this one.
All right, and Chris?
Good morning, Christian Parks, consultant with Somerset Community Services down here on the lovely Eastern Shore of Maryland.
And we have Shauna.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shauna Mulcahy. I'm the Executive Director with the ARC of Frederick County.
And Greg.
Good morning as well. Greg Miller, President and CEO at Penmore Human Services and part of the early adopter group.
Right, welcome again to everyone. Good to have everyone back together to continue our discussions. We go to the next slide, please. Now I am going to turn it over to the Hilltop Institute to share a bit about their progress on the general ledger data collection process.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm Kristen Deal with the Hilltop Institute. And as the cycle ended last year, we've been spending the past few months working with a group of providers who volunteered to participate in the General Ledger Data Collection Pilot Work Group. We are excited to share more about the work group progress and next steps with the RAG today. Hilltop was appreciative of the feedback that the RAG shared via our survey prior to the start of the work group, and we were able to incorporate your edits as we got started. Next slide, please. So today we want to talk about the two primary purposes of the pilot provider general ledger group. The first was to provide feedback on the draft general ledger template collection, tool, instructions, and process. And so we had some discussions with the work group about the ability to implement collecting data via the template on an annual basis, starting with fiscal year 24. We asked them feedback on the instructions, were they clear? Were there additional details or clarifications that we could add that would help to make it more clear and concise for all providers. We asked them their feedback on how long it would take to compile the requested data, and then how long it would take to input that data into the template. And then we talked a little bit about the processes being used by the providers, and asked them to share so we could identify any best practices that could also be shared with the larger provider network. The second purpose was to actually have the providers complete the draft general ledger template collection, so that we could have them consider if their systems were currently set up in a way to collect the data as it was being requested, and what level of lift may be to make edits as needed. And then also to consider the feedback with the development of the instructions, standardized guidance, and technical assistance that could be provided to help with the implementation of this annual data collection process. We also were very open to any other questions or discussion items that came up throughout the process. Next slide, please. So to talk a little bit, just an overview of the work group timeline. The DDA provider network was solicited in October 2022 for interest in participation in the work group. So all DDA providers received an email, and we requested feedback via a survey by October 26th. We did collect some additional information from those interested providers to ensure that we were getting a diverse representative group of providers in our group. We did have 15 providers who responded, and all were invited to join the work group. One additional provider was identified at the recommendation of a regional office so that we could make sure that all of the regional offices had representation. The initial meeting with the group was held on November 16th. We talked through the goals of the work group and shared the draft general ledger template with them. Providers raised some key questions during this initial meeting and provided some feedback. So we were able to make some initial edits prior to sharing the draft with the provider group. We had 3 technical assistance meetings in November and December. Providers raised topics for discussion via email and during the calls. Discussions ensued around key areas with providers sharing input and experiences. We did take meeting notes with key items discussed, and they were shared with the providers after each meeting. We also provided some targeted technical or some targeted outreach to those providers who the team had not heard from, our Hilltop team, either in the meetings or via email in late December. We did some additional targeted outreach in January as the due date for the templates came about. Next slide, please. And so we did want to share a little bit of information with you about the volunteers, just to show how diverse and representative the group was. And again, as all providers who responded to our invitation to participate were included in the group and attended at least one meeting. And as I mentioned, the Eastern Regional Office gave us a recommendation to ensure that we had adequate coverage for all the regions. Next slide, please. Providers were asked to identify the number of unduplicated participants served annually, along with the number and size of any residential sites operated. And so as you can see, we had a diverse group of providers of varying sizes. Next slide, please. One additional data point collected was the number of participants served in Meaningful Day and support services to ensure providers of all sizes were included in the work group. The goal was to bring together a diverse representative group of providers to review the general ledger template, instructions, and process. The work group metrics lend support to the diversity of providers included and the ability to get feedback from a representative group. Next slide, please. The draft template was updated after our initial meeting to allow flexibility for providers who may have billed in the same services in both PCIS2 and LTSS Maryland during the same fiscal year. So this was a key discussion topic brought up early on. Some additional topics that we covered including cost categories, were bonuses and overtime pay. So determining the appropriate cost category for allocating bonuses and overtime pay. We did discuss this over several technical assistance calls. Hilltop consulted with Optimus and then engaged in further discussions with the group to get input on the provider's ability to separate the overtime by the base wage and time and a half, allocating the base wage to direct care staff and overtime half-time portion to employee-related expenses. Additionally, providers overwhelmingly noted that residential services were more likely to have overtime wages. We discussed the inclusion of depreciation and interest as allowable cost. This was a question raised by the group. We did have Robert White join us for a call, and he provided some initial feedback to the group that further discussions would ensue to determine the policy related to depreciation and interest, and further guidance will be shared. We talked about cost categories and utilization in the BRIC by service. So the group had questions related to whether all cost categories were included in the BRIC for each service. So Hilltop did note that not all 7 cost categories are used in the BRIC for all services. For example, CMS does not allow facility costs in residential. However, it is essential that we collect the cost data from providers to account for all of the costs related to providing a service. The data could also be used to inform additional analyses and priorities as identified during the rate cycle. Next slide, please. So some additional key discussions were related to services and wanting to get the most efficient way to capture dedicated hours and add-on supports. So again, we had lots of discussions around the challenges with breaking out the cost for one-on-one and add-on supports. Providers noted it would be challenging to break out or allocate these costs across all categories for these services. The level of effort and accounting system changes required to provide data at the service level. And so, for example, meaningful day services. Providers also asked for guidance to establish a consistent methodology for allocating costs according to revenue. There were several discussions about how costs should be allocated. We had some providers share their current methodology, but the group did discuss that being able to have a consistent methodology across providers would ensure that we were collecting the data consistently across the system. Next slide, please. So our next steps, we have currently received 7 templates back from our provider work group, and 5 providers submitted some additional feedback on our template process and level of effort. So we are currently in the process of reviewing the templates that we received along with the feedback submitted from the work group. We are identifying key areas for discussion with DDA and Optimus, and we'll use those key areas and discussions to make any necessary edits to the template and supporting documents. Hilltop will share the revised template with the RAG members at the March meeting. I can turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you. Great, thank you, Kristen, for that update. In short, we. Did someone have a question?
Scott Hollingsworth. Scott Hollingsworth. I'm wondering, we have a couple of members in this committee who are part of the General Ledger Pilot Group. I don't know whether we could give them 2 or 3 minutes to hear anything, if they have anything that they would add. I'm just curious, since this is so important for this group to understand. If there's not time, I understand.
I think we can take a couple minutes for that, sure. Do we have anyone who wanted to provide additional feedback? Why don't we continue on in the agenda, and if folks want to talk about the data template more, We've got some open discussion time at the end of the agenda, and I think we want to have some more robust discussion next month about it as well. So, I mean, in short, we want to use the process that Kristen just was talking about to ensure consistency across the provider network and ensure that data is interpreted uniformly by providers and the DDA. We believe that having comprehensive, detailed data could potentially reduce the need for ad hoc data requests and inform rate review priorities. For data requests in the interim, the state will continue to share with the RREG data summaries and certainly consider requests for additional analyses or looks at data that may support the group in identifying rate review priorities. And of course, providers have the ability to share raw data with each other if they would like to. Why don't we transition now to our brief overview of the rate development process. So as we talked about last year as well, this process involves collecting provider data, organizing that data into sub-cost categories, gathering feedback on the data and categories, adjusting the data for program or policy changes and trends, considering administrative costs, and finally gathering stakeholder feedback. These components are framework for rate reviews, which ensure that rate priorities are data informed and based on cost of services per hour. Next slide, please. Now I will walk you through a brief overview of the rate review cycle itself. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. Here is the annual schedule of activities and deliverables for our long-term maintenance of DDA rates. Following today's meeting, next month we will want to finalize and prioritize issues of interest to review this cycle. March is focused on gathering stakeholder feedback on potential rate modifications. In April, we'll share results and analyses. May and June will include rate update presentations with discussion. In July, we'll consult with MDH leadership and with the Department of Budget and Management on any proposed rate changes. August and early September are dedicated to analyzing provider impact and budget simulation. And next slide, please. Here is another view of this year's rate review cycle with the work of the RREG alongside the state of Maryland fiscal year milestones. Targeted dates for group decisions are anchored in the Maryland Department of Health operating budget cycle. I can actually, if someone could put a link in the chat to material on DBM's website about the operating budget cycle, that would be fantastic. Do we have any questions about the schedule?
Jennifer, Chris Parks. Just will we be able to anticipate some feedback on the GL tool in February or in March?
So I believe Hilltop's plan is to have the tool ready for our RREG's feedback in March. Kristen, can you confirm that?
Yes, that is correct.
Thank you.
Jennifer, can I just ask, just trying to think about how that feedback will be meaningful. I guess we could just think, you all could be thinking as we get closer to the March meeting, whether it's provided in advance with enough time for some adequate review, or if it's presented at the March meeting, you know, how much time there will be to provide feedback.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely want to make sure we have good discussion and provide opportunity for review so that everyone can give feedback from an informed place. Absolutely.
Jennifer, Chris, again, just a follow-up to
Sure.
Laura's question there. Are we going to be actually able to see the actual feedback from the pilot group as part of the presentation? I know Optimus is going to review the feedback and make changes, but I think it would be helpful if we were able to see the actual feedback from the providers as well, too.
That is a good point, and we will take that suggestion back, and we'll get you an answer.
Thank you.
Jennifer, this is Maria. Just a question on the timing. If the template's not going to be shared in March, is it the intent to use the data that's collected from the template for this next rate review cycle? Because the previous slide showed analysis start being done in April, so I'm unclear how the template's going to inform this rate review cycle.
Yeah, I think we will likely be in a position to start implementing the template with the next rate review cycle. I think this cycle will likely be more of the data requests tailored to the specific issues that we want to look at. We certainly don't want to rush implementing a large change like the general ledger data template, but we want to keep making progress towards getting it implemented. So I think we'll likely be shooting to implement it for next year.
Okay, and then an ad hoc process for this
correct
near-term rate cycle. Okay,
right. As we finalize the template and kind of provide that TA to providers, I think that's just as important as the template itself, making sure everyone knows how to use it. But yeah, I don't think we would be in a position to use the template as soon as April.
Jennifer, just one last quick question. Can you share who the three RRAG members are who are part of the GL group?
Kristen or Robert, do you have that information?
I don't have the information off the top of my head, but we can share it shortly in the chat.
Great, thank you.
Why don't we move forward to our next section, which is going to be a conversation on rate review priorities for this year. So I will turn it over to Optimus.
Hi, this is Chris Walsh with Optimus. So yeah, I appreciate that. We mostly want to have that kind of engaged discussion and hear feedback today. So we just have a few slides here to kind of help us all have, a consistent framework for what kind of things we're looking to talk about and approaches we might want to take. So on this first slide here, we're looking at some of the outcomes. We want to make sure that stakeholders understand the process and we have feedback. We're able to collect that, and everything is as transparent as it can be. That we adhere to that timeline that we provided and have timely rate reviews and adjustments so that we can kind of consistently make progress and move forward. We want to have a timely process for the collection and review of feedback so that we can have that long-term development and maintenance of DDA rates. I know a lot of times, when people have various feelings about certain rate issues or process here, the desire is to say, let's make this change right now. Let's make this change right now. And it's something we want to make sure that we're thinking long-term. How is this all going to work together, and how can we make sure that we're hitting everything as we go through that process. We're trying to have a more consistent Medicaid rate setting process and having a strong program and appropriate stewardship of those public funds. Very important. Move on to the next slide. As we're talking about considering some of the options that we can look into immediately, these are some ways that you can consider how we might prioritize some of those issues. We're looking at how many people and services are impacted, or providers, so they're impacted. how it compares, like Jennifer mentioned early on, the relevance to the DDA values and focus areas. If this is something that is more of a short-term priority versus a long-term priority, and there's lots of various ways we can do it. We're not saying that any one of these is the only consideration or the right consideration, but just these are some things you might want to start thinking about as we start talking about what are some options we have and how might we try to prioritize them. So the next couple slides will, yeah, go ahead.
Chris, just want to make a point. I think we need to take in the severity of the impact as well, too.
Sure, yeah.
Scope, size, shape, but how big is the problem?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next couple of slides, we wanted to just provide some prompts. These are some things that we had talked about with various stakeholders at various times, so that we can kind of say these are some things we can start off with, or if there's other things that haven't been mentioned here, that's something we can add in. So I'm just going to go through and point out a few of these, and then we'll have that kind of open discussion where we can talk about which of these do we think are our priorities, or do we need to address them different ways or add other pieces here. So, again, these are things that we've talked about with various stakeholders or feedback that we've heard. We've tried to capture, as much of it as we thought we could without, duplicating too much here. So first thing is whether those rates sufficiently capture non-billable staff time, or if that's something that needs to be reviewed and potentially adjusted. Looking at the policy for group sizes, specifically for day services, so the 1-to-1, 2-to-1, small group, large group, and how that compares to those operational needs. Talking about a few different components. Main piece here has been on the transportation component equity. I know in the past we talked about kind of that fixed versus variable cost and how those costs are distributed across the various services. Collecting data and considering adjustments to address the varying level of need or acuity or severity for different members. I know specifically some stakeholders have talked about that with regards to residential settings, but that can be something that is more broad as well. Some of the difficulties in transitioning to a new system, and if there's any adjustments that need to be considered or made there. Talking about the employment services rate development, I know there was some concerns or confusion around the information there, and I think that's something that people have asked about a little bit. Looking at the assumptions and how they compare to the waiver policy and the new amendment. So making sure that, the math matches the policy, and making sure we're kind of on the same page there. And then identifying strategies to support a career path development for DSPs. So these are things that are more about kind of the rate construct. If we go on to the next slide, we're going to have a few more different topics we'll bring up. These are some of the rate components we might address. So talking about alignment and clarity in operational policies, making sure that everyone understands and that those policies match how the model itself is built, and the service delivery, operational policies and the service delivery matches with the guidance and the waiver documents. We want to make sure everyone understands attendance policies like no-show and cancellation, and those are reflected in a reasonable way in the rates. We talked about turnover and the relationship between wages and staff turnover, and I know that's also been a hot topic, especially with the inflation figures that have come out a lot over the last year. And then finally, reviewing some of the daily staff hour assumptions in residential services. So just as a reminder, many services are in things like a 15-minute unit or an hour unit. So for residential, it's billed in a day unit. And so going into that rate, there's kind of an assumption of how many hours per day of staff time are appropriate at each level. So again, that's not going to capture everything. We tried to get a broad swath there, but if we go on to the next slide, this is really where we wanted to open it up. Those are just some prompts to kind of get us started. Are these priorities reflective of the community interests, or are there other areas, considerations that you might support some recommendations for the rate setting priorities? And I will also point out that we do have, if we can't quite get to something, or it comes up after the meeting, we do have an email address set up now for any of those additional considerations be shared. We just ask that that's shared very quickly, as we do have the next meeting February 9th, where we want to start kind of narrowing down our list to what are we going to address first in our list of priorities. So with that, I'll just kind of open it up to the group and see, what do we think of some of those priorities that have been brought up? What do we think is the most important, or are there any other things that we think we should add to that list and consider?
Chris, it's Chris Parks. I think I'd like to add to that just the structure of our RAG and our use of the subgroups that were approved last year. I think we need to at least address that game plan early on. We've got a lot to accomplish, and I think we're going to need those subgroups to achieve what we're trying to achieve. So I think we should address that issue fairly early on in this process of if, when, and how those subgroups are going to be used.
And it's Laura. Can I just jump in? Chris is kind of scaring me because he keeps making the comment I'm about to make. So thank you, Chris. But I was going to say, I think it would be helpful to have a discussion about how subcommittees might help us address a broader array of some of the issues and priorities, rather than pushing too many off to future years.
I would really agree with that as well. I think the subcommittees will be able to work on it certainly a little bit quicker, but also be able to present a little more, perhaps, of the detail that the stakeholders are looking for.
I would also add that I'm curious about, we were asked to fill out a form last year about recommended subcommittees and why we thought it was critical, and I don't recall ever seeing the outcome of that. And so I think being transparent about what was brought forward by committee members would be great.
Why don't we make sure we devote some time on our next agenda specifically to talking about subcommittees, and we can provide that information that you just requested as well.
So this is Maria. I have a question. I know we're talking about priorities for fiscal 25. Is that right? Are there changes in the rates that came out of the last RAG for fiscal 24 that you can share, so that we're not repeating some of whatever we discussed last year? Because some of the list includes things that we talked about last year, and I'm assuming those are still unresolved, as opposed to is there anything that was resolved and is being implemented as part of fiscal 24 changes?
I kind of had the same question in regards to that whole process. So, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but so we have seen the first draft of our new governor's budget, and of course none of that is approved and funded through the legislature yet. But obviously there were pieces there that looked like he was attempting to address some of the concerns. Specifically with transportation and meaningful day, through the allocation of resources. And if we're working on the next year's budget in this group, when we can have clarity about how this year's budget affects that, would probably be helpful for us to know what exactly it is that we're, what that lift potentially is, or if some of that has been resolved through, it just feels like we're always just a little bit behind, or we're going to be a little bit ahead of ourselves, not really knowing exactly where we are currently. until the budgets kind of work their way through the legislature. And maybe that doesn't make sense, but
no, that's a very good point. Since the governor's budget was just released this past Friday. Robert, are there any additional specifics, details you can share right now, or is your team still analyzing what's in the governor's budget?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. We are still parsing out the details for that. What I can tell you, though, is that we've taken the analysis that Optimus presented during the last cycle related to the data they collected regarding transportation. And if you recall, they recommended an adjustment to that component of the brick. And so we do know that is part of it, but we're still parsing out all of the details, and hopefully we'll be able to have this as an agenda item for the next meeting and get into more of the details. Absolutely. Sorry, any additional questions for Optimus? Okay, so we are, we're really ahead of schedule, and so we actually have some time for some group discussion. So thank you, Optimus, and members for that discussion on the FY23 priorities. So, I'm going to open up the floor for any walk-on items and/or other things that members may want to discuss.
This is Scott Hollingsworth, and maybe it goes back to Optimus. Just because I don't want to leave the impression that these priorities aren't important to us. Every one of these is very important. The expectation that we can prioritize them, I think we all understand they're so interconnected, and the processes for this committee are going to be so important. I'm a little disappointed that there's no one to speak to, the comments about committees. If we have time, isn't there time to discuss that at this point? I'm hearing silence, which is suggesting to me that the committees are not on the table, which I think is going to limit the depth, that we can get into, because these priorities, and I appreciate this slide, Chris, the slide and a half. These are, you captured good stuff there. It's really, really critical. So I don't want to leave the impression, since there's a little bit of, I'm a little bit stumped on how we're going to proceed with that. And couldn't we have a conversation right now? We've got time. How would committee structure work? And if it's really something that's not on the table, you probably ought to be frank with us. Anyway, I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any interpretation that I didn't think these were important.
So I don't think it's accurate to say that subcommittees are not on the table. It's built into our reg charter, so certainly a tool we have available to us. At the same time, we have limited resources on our end, so I don't want to create the expectation that we could staff numerous subcommittees. But I think, especially since we have so much time, it would be interesting and helpful to us to get feedback from all of you if we were to implement a small number of subcommittees. What are there specific topics you would especially like to see subcommittees tackle? What would you like to see that process look like?
I'll just throw in my 2 cents here. Just for the background, we did hear that, and we did have some discussions kind of behind the scenes about how that might be set up, how that might work, and what things need to happen in order for everything to fall within the charter and make sure that everything is is being done properly. So it's definitely something that the wheels have been turning around and figuring out the process forward. And I just wanted to point out, as we talk about that, some things that you may want to consider again for subcommittee work. We hear like some of you have mentioned that you can often maybe get to a little bit more detail. You may be able to work a little bit quicker. Also, in doing that, that might be some subset of RAG members, and so then we need to bring that back to the whole RAG, and there may be additional discussions to be had there. So we just want to figure out, where is it most appropriate? Where might we need to have those more detailed, nuanced conversations that we can really spend that time on? It's better suited there rather than having the whole RAG.
Chris, I'll say this. I think there's a lot of complex areas. I mean, the GL data collection tool, for example, data collection as a whole, I think certainly should be a subgroup. I think it gives us the ability to kind of dig in, but also expedite. We're meeting roughly 2 hours a month, which gives us about 20 hours of combined effort, at least in discussion. And I think what we're looking for is to have the discussion once a month, but to be able to do some legwork behind the scenes, to be able to come back and advance each of those topics significantly further than we're able to in just the 2-hour meeting. That's the role that I see of the subgroup specifically. Again, I think we can make a list of a bunch of them that would be pertinent, but when and how they tie into our overall schedule, I think, is the key. That the purpose, in my mind, of the subgroups is to do the homework and bring the homework back and present it to the class.
This is Karen Adams-Gilchrist. I guess to Greg Miller's point, is it possible for you guys to run through the priorities that we talked about for 2024? Is it possible to run through those priorities and give us a status on those things? Since we are now talking about 2025, it really would be great to know what the status is on those priorities that we identified before. Is it possible to do that now, since we have time?
So I'll give DDA an opportunity to answer that question. I think Robert had mentioned, making those adjustments to transportation based on the feedback and the data that were collected in the last cycle. That was one of the most impactful changes. But I think that's a good point where we can try to look at, what were the priorities and where did we end up on each of those. I don't have that, right at my fingertips, but that's something we could certainly pull together and have available. Also, with these questions about the governor's budget and how that may impact things, having worked in rate setting in various states for a number of years and seeing how this works, you can make all the plans that you want to make. I'm sure we are all kind of aware of that when the legislature comes in and makes changes. Then it's time to kind of go back and look at things and react accordingly. So if there are any adjustments that may come out of that new budget, that's something that we would also need to consider, but it sounds like that's very much in draft at the moment, and we'll see how that progresses through things. So I don't know if DDA would like to provide more of a response on the list of fiscal year 24 priorities and any updates accordingly, but I think that's kind of our perspective.
Yeah, I also don't have it kind of organized that way right at my fingertips, but I think that's something we can certainly pull together and distribute to the group well in advance of the next meeting, so that we can use that in guiding which priorities we choose. that makes sense. We can, just to be clear, what we could distribute is something that says, okay, here were the priorities we worked on last year, and here's the current status. We can definitely we'll work on pulling that together. Good suggestion.
Thanks, Jennifer. This is Laura. I think that I'm feeling a little worried about how we're going to progress this year. Last year was a big learning curve, I think, for all of us about this process. And I just think we really have to, kind of right out of the gate as much as we can, figure out how this process is going to be, I think more meaningful and productive, in our second year, and build on last year, and also hopefully improve on last year. And I think, you were, gracious in acknowledging last year that it was a learning curve, and that we, there are things that we need to do. I think 2 hours a month just it isn't close to what we need at this point, given where things are with rates. So I don't know what we can do. I know it's a public process, but I think there has to be some way for us to figure out for this to be more, a little more productive, and carve out some time, whether it's subcommittees, some communication that can certainly be shared with the public at each meeting, but some communication between meetings, whatever we can do to improve that, I think, would be beneficial.
I mean, I think it's also important to acknowledge that, while we certainly had a lot of things that we learned from that experience that we're trying to improve on with this year, last year's process did make a difference. While we still need to crunch numbers to understand the full impact, some of your suggestions were in the governor's budget. So this process does have meaning. If I don't want to create the impression that it doesn't. But obviously, we're always open to feedback.
I don't either. That's why I referred to it as a learning curve. And we are very appreciative that the department put, things forward to address some of the concerns. So I don't want anything I said to be taken as if we don't appreciate that, because we certainly do.
This is Scott, and yeah, I agree with you, Laura, and I do appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. I'm looking at this list and wondering if there aren't some bundles of topics, the non-billable staff time, group size. Could we bundle some of these together so it's not 7, 8, 9, 10 committees? I think employment services has to be somewhere in there as an employment first state, and we do a lot of employment, and I know what that means. Maybe another option, I don't know if we could look at how we might combine some topics that are linked, and we can't have a zillion committees, but somehow have some more conversations, and those non-billable group size and maybe employment, because there's a lot of non-billable time in employment supports.
And this is Chris Parks. I would have to agree with Scott. I think it makes sense to take a look at our priorities now. I know we still got some 24 items that I'm sure there's needed discussion, but does it make sense to take the identified priorities and try to establish subgroups or work groups based on that? It would at least help expedite some of the movement of, even if it's just questions or if it's research or whatever, thoughts, gather data from providers to be able to circle back and bring that back to the group. And we can do that. We're not going to accomplish that in a 2-hour window. Can we do that between meetings somehow with the subgroups and bring back and proceed in pushing each of them along a little further each time?
think that the thoughts about maybe grouping some of these priorities is interesting. Can we go back to some of the priority slides? I'm curious to hear thoughts on what some good groupings might be.
I'm not sure who's controlling the deck right now, but that would just be the slide before this and the one before that as well, if we can take a look at those just to kind of remind ourselves. Thanks. The one, yep, here we go, this one and the following one.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I don't want to get off of this, but in regards to this, some rate changes or recommendations may not necessarily have a fiscal note to them. It just might be how we do billing differently. And for example, the original recommendation from the Employment First group was that job development also be a milestone, and at some time it got changed into an hourly rate system. So looking at things not about adding more money, but spending money differently or structuring the rate differently, is that a part of our dialogue, or is it only about the amount of money, or just out of curiosity about the scope of the work that we're doing?
I think discussions about structure are definitely valuable. We'll have to see if different suggestions come up, what the department will implement, but yeah, I think we would certainly be interested in talking about that and hearing thoughts on structure.
So I think to look at the groupings, there are some things that are pervasive over everything, like attendance policy, relations with wages and staff turnover, unless there's something more specific than this. And then on the other page, the non-billable time and employment certainly go together. Was this list informed from the poll that you asked us to do on the Google spreadsheets last year on the issues that we brought forward and the committees we thought should be there, or?
I know that we had a similar slide last year, and we've kind of updated it according to anything that's happened since last year and any additional feedback that we've heard since last year. So I'm not sure how that necessarily relates to that Google form, but that's essentially what we've kind of taken what we had heard prior to last year and then kind of updated with anything that's happened since then.
So it doesn't specifically take into account the requests that you asked us to complete on the Google Forms with the concerns, because we were pretty specific. I think the way that those questions were asked, it was pretty specific about what we thought each group should do.
Just so I'm clear, are you referring to the Google form that was asking about suggestions for subgroups?
Yes, and a part of that
okay
was also, what were the topics at hand, and so I felt like that was a really nice way of getting some specific information, and I'm just wondering how that work you asked us to do is informing this.
Right. I think the response we got to that Google form was pretty limited. If I remember right, I think we've captured those concerns on this list, but if not, we can go back and make sure we've done that. I think that's a good point.
And, you know, we took a little more time in terms of pulling together some feedback, but have not made recommendations about subgroups, but certainly in light of this conversation, you know, can provide some feedback, and then that, you know, combined with what you've received, maybe that will be helpful moving forward.
That would be great.
Like Scott again, Laura, to the point of you know, a month, and then we've got 7 more. My question to you, Laura, is would you be able to give feedback before next month? You know, or what I'm wondering about is, could we have a small group of people talking about committees? So next month we're not having this conversation, or could we do this via email in some fashion? So I don't know, Laura, would there be a way for you to give some recommendations before next month?
We certainly can, yeah. And then I guess Jennifer and Robert, you know, you should just let us know, you know, kind of the, you know, the most effective way from your perspective for us to provide that feedback.
I mean, I think we have the dedicated email box now, so if you want to send it there, then if we have some follow-up questions, we can certainly talk about it from there. But I think a great starting point would be sending the suggestions to that email box.
And I guess I was just going to say,
go ahead,
question. I think your question is, so we can provide the feedback, but then, you know, is there anything? I guess the question is, how do we not lose kind of another 2 months? So if we come back and then it's on the agenda in February, and then is it March or April before, you know, something gets started with any subcommittees?
Right. I think that that's a valid concern and something we definitely need to consider as we figure out the best way to implement this, for sure.
And I'll volunteer that if you gather all of this information and you want a small group of people to come together to put forward a recommendation of subgroups, I'm willing to sit on that if we want to get it done so that we can present it for deliberation next meeting and be all prepared for that. And I'm sure others would be willing to sit on a group like that as well to get this moving forward. So other than during this meeting on in an external meeting, I'm happy to do that.
But it sounds like the very first subgroup that we need is a subgroup on subgroups. But I definitely think supporting Scott's perspective on kind of combining some of these together makes sense. I mean, in just kind of looking at them, knowing what our priorities are. I mean, I wrote down 5, which is a policy subgroup, because a lot of these issues can kind of be grouped into that same content. Still a day rate subgroup. I think an employment services subgroup. And I think there needs to be a data collection subgroup, which could include the current GL piece, but that subgroup could, you know, some of these subgroups need to exist for not just this year. We need to look at what do we need moving forward that we're constantly and consistently going to be having conversations about. Policy is definitely it. Data collection is definitely it. Hopefully at some point, day rates and employment services are corrected to the point where we could possibly stop talking about them. But I think that that's several years down the road. And then maybe one more that is just a general, I don't want to say catch-all, but a catch-all subgroup. But I think Laura's point, Karen's point, Scott's point, we've got to get something going now and quickly. Otherwise, we're going to be halfway through the rate cycle before we even have the ability to have our first subgroup meeting.
This is Robert. You know, we have 50 minutes left in this session roughly, and I'm wondering if we could kind of take advantage of that time. And I've heard of a few things here. One is looking at these rate priorities and trying to group them. And then I think once we are able to do that, have a discussion about how to prioritize those groups for our consideration. And some of that, and Chris, you mentioned some broader subgroups, but then based on those buckets and how we prioritize them, there may be some opportunities for those ad hoc subgroups that you talked about as well. Is that something we can do over the next 50 minutes?
I think we should need to.
Yeah, and I wonder, maybe we should, how many subgroups are realistic? You know, we may have to say, because even though I hear what you're saying, but I don't see us doing 5. I may be wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a valid point, Scott. I mean, we obviously would have to go back and take a look at it and see what we can support from a resource perspective based on the priorities.
But maybe 3, you know, could we, I don't know whether that would help frame the discussion if we had some sense of what we're really, what number. I did hear Karen talk about, you know, staff, what was the word, what has it, wages and turnover. And then there's also career pathways. They seem to go together. I don't want to, I really, and I don't mean to monopolize this, but I really have a lot of respect for the way Laura thinks. And if she would like a little time to think about it, but, and I agree, Robert, if we can do some of it now, it'd be great.
Yeah, I have to admit, I am feeling the need to sort of have a little bit of thinking time, but I think having maybe some initial discussion makes sense as well. And then maybe we could take that and, follow up with some feedback in the next week. And I see Maria, so maybe she has some feedback as well.
The thing I want to make sure is that we're not duplicating efforts. And I know, not to put you on the spot, Nick, Burton, but there's some work going on outside of the RAG process related to employment. And if anything changed from a policy perspective that would inform rates, that would obviously come back to RAG, but I don't know if it would be duplication to, it would probably duplicate a lot of what's already going on in a different forum. So we just want to be cognizant of that as well. Marie, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, yeah, and I agree with the comments. Scott, as I see this list, I see it, at least those first 3 as really technical, kind of rate setting methodology and assumptions. Really, they are tied to the day rate, but they also potentially cross all of the services from the methodology standpoint, because we want to be consistent and fair and then then there's some policy items that I think, as we've talked about, really need to make sure that the policy is aligned with the rate setting assumption. But if there's areas where the billing guidance needs to be clear, or the policy and there's some disconnect, I think that's also has been raised, and that's really important, obviously, for alignment. So there could be a policy committee, and then acuity has, that's one of those bullets, again, that maybe separate and touches a different service and will be a longer run. But I think I'm seeing about 5 committees as well, kind of through this list and consolidation, and that the question Scott asked was, how many can we reasonably tackle? But I do think we could probably group some and work effectively to at least hopefully get some more resolution on the issues. I think that is going to be really important this year. And I can, I'll share some notes back with Laura, and we can try to categorize what we think makes sense.
Yeah, as Scott said, the career pathways and turnover, we certainly have the data, the research is out there, as well as in this state, funded by the Department of Labor here in this state, that career pathways does reduce turnover significantly. And so I think putting those two together makes sense and is a high priority on something that needs to be discussed, is how we will structure a rate to ensure that we have opportunity for the training dollars, as well as the funding of a career pathway and the ongoing infrastructure needed to support career pathways. So I think those two are critical today, but also can be put together.
Curious if other committee members have other thoughts on any of this.
I guess one of the questions that I have is what is happening system-wide in some of these areas outside of this group? Like I know DDA has talked about the career path development and all, and that whole process. What is going on? It just seems like these are issues that inform the rate structure. So it kind of all lands here, but I'm not sure all of the subgroups need to come out of this body here. If some of these are being addressed in other places, we don't want the RRAG subgroup on career pathways, and then DDA has their thing going, and somebody, so that would be my only concern, is that in terms of us actually doing our job as part of this group and doing it well, what do we need to do that's not being done right now at all? And are there other places where we need to collaborate or be part of something that may already be in the works?
Can I also just jump in and say that in addition to what Greg just said, that I think in terms of efficiency and also narrowing down what this group tries to tackle this year, that just to go back to an earlier point, having some sense of what the plan would be from the department for the particularly the 20 million that is in the governor's budget for rates and LTSS to address, the language was vague, but certainly I think included transportation as one piece. And I think some of the concerns about the meaningful day rates. I know it's not final, but it would really be helpful to have a sense where that gets us, so we know whether that, for example, transportation would be in a much better place, or if it's that it's still something that would need some focus. And just to be clear, I'm not asking for an answer right now, but just I think it would be helpful, certainly before the next meeting, to have some sense of that.
So Dr. Smalls or Don, do we have the ability to do a virtual whiteboard? I think we can, at least from what I'm hearing, there's at least 4 different categories that we could put on the screen and perhaps at least start to prioritize what those are, so that we can take that back internally and look at it from a resource perspective after having conversations with leadership. Not as familiar with.
I think is there not something going on with a work group on employment? I'm just surprised if there's not. Years ago, we all were in all these darn committees, and it was a mess. Let me rephrase that. We were all busy. But is there not? I think you made a good point, Greg. Can we? That's a little bit why I asked about the GL question. You know, is there somebody in that providing the GL group we could bring in and get some input? But that's a good point, Greg.
Sure, Scott, thank you for that question. Nick, if you're able to unmute yourself and would like to comment on Scott's question.
Yeah, can everybody hear me? I wasn't sure if I was unable to unmute and people could hear me. So Laura, can you hear me? Just raise your hand. Okay, great. So Scott, yeah, there is an employment first group that meets and meets regularly, and just as recently as I think a week ago, some goals and objectives and outcomes were sent to that group. And I think one of the objectives from that group was to review employment services and do some surveying with people that are in and outside of LTSS, to then be able to come back together and make recommendations to this group for consideration related to the rates. So that certainly has been something that we've been talking about for a few months. And that's something that the next meeting, which I believe is February 3rd, don't quote me on that, the group is going to finalize agreement on the outcomes and then get the subcommittee set up, and so that work can start. And obviously being cognizant of the RREG timelines that exist to make sure that those recommendations get here in the right time. Does that help answer that question, Scott, a little bit?
Yes, Tim, thank you.
Like I said, it helps for me. I think what's vital though is that and Nick, I applaud what you're doing with this group. What, you know, in terms of what we're trying to do here, I guess the question would be, okay, so we only meet a certain number of months a year, and we only have a certain amount of time to process what either request or proposed changes are going to be for the following year, which isn't even which is a year and a half from now. So you know, as we look at how this could actually work in terms of being efficient, can we, you know, should we, one of the things that we do as a group, try to figure out, okay, so when is this employment group going to come and make a presentation to the Rate Review Advisory Committee so we can hear what you've done, how you've come up with what you're proposing, and then we have time to process that and figure out how to move that, as opposed to, you know, there's lots of groups meeting all over the place, but it's not going to do us any good, you know, in October to, you know, that you've come up with these great ideas, because now we're going to be out another year. So I think it's just a matter of trying to figure out what do we need to do, this group here, what do we need to do to advance whatever the true priorities are? What else is being done out there, and how are we going to ensure that that great work gets wrapped into our work so that we can get our hands around it and figure out whether we want to make recommendations, you know, in a timely manner. because these things just go on. And I mean, we have been talking about supporting career path for 10 years. Okay. What does that mean relevant to this particular group? You know, we're a rate review advisory committee. Are we going to make recommendations about how we better compensate organizations that have credentialed staff? Is that even possible? Can that be done? I mean, there are different layers to all of these things. And I don't want to see us biting off so many things that we end up not doing anything really, really well. I think the very top priorities are the ones that we want to make sure that we have actionable steps that we're going to encourage for what actually is going to happen a year and a half from now and how that gets wrapped into our rates. So, I mean, I think we're all kind of on the same page. Everybody wants to do the right thing and get the important stuff done. It's just a matter of how do we bite that off here and how do we piggyback the good work that's being done out there, but make sure that that information and that good work is being brought into this group for potential actionable, things for us to push forward. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, Greg, this is Nick. I'll say that it does make sense from my perspective in regards to some of the employment conversations that we're having. And, you know, I think certainly me coordinating with Robert based on what this group has decided they want to do, I think Robert and I will work very closely on that so that it's not that those recommendations get to this group at the right time so that that work is being incorporated into decisions that are being made, if at all possible. But that's something I'll want to coordinate with Robert, but I definitely hear what you're saying.
Well, and to that point also, Nick, I think that, you know, clarity is kindness. And I sense there's a level of frustration in some of these things in that we don't really know what, we don't really know for sure where we are. And so it's hard to know exactly how to get where we think we need to go. So an example of that is what Laura just brought up. So we have seen a proposed budget that makes an investment in transportation and we think Meaningful Day. Not knowing what that is makes it very hard for us sitting here not to still be a little bit frustrated about the fact that we know that Meaningful Day and transportation are not being addressed properly currently. As soon as we have clarity on what has happened and what looks like is going to be the actual case moving forward, it takes some of that edge off to know, okay, hey, maybe it solved the problem. Maybe it didn't solve the problem, but to Laura's point, it went a large way to solve the problem. Well, then how we address that gap could be fundamentally different than if it doesn't solve the problem at all. And I think that's kind of I think part of the frustration that you hear today is you've got a group of high performing, for the most part, I think, high performing executives and CEOs that are used to getting stuff done, don't want to talk about it, want to figure out how to make it happen. And we feel kind of stuck because we're not really sure how we can take those next steps to really help to make this stuff happen.
Yeah, Greg, thanks. Obviously, thanks for sharing that. Absolutely. I think this is a group of doers, so I definitely hear and see that and can appreciate that as well. So I don't want to hijack any more of this R-rate group because I know I'm not the leader of it. So I'll turn it back over to Robert right now in terms of anything else regarding this group, and then stand by ready to support what's happening in the Employment First work group and getting down to work and getting things done there so that things can move over here.
The reality of what funding may become available in July is obviously a wild card and important. But I also think we need to acknowledge that the rates are designed to be what they need to be, you know, regardless of of funding. So we still, I think, have an obligation as a committee to say, no, this is what the rates should be. This is the cost. This is what they should be, regardless of funding, so that we can kind of get there. I mean, the reality is a little different than that, but we're always going to be behind the budget cycle on this. So yeah, that's a comment.
So one thing I think I'm hearing here that I think we can definitely take some action on is just kind of, it sounds like folks feel they need more information to kind of understand where we are, to know where we want to go. And that makes sense to me, absolutely. I'm thinking some of the things we need to pull together as soon as possible would be kind of a chart that has issues grouped, any other committees that might be working on that issue, any notes we have on the timing between those other groups and our work, and a more detailed analysis of what's in the governor's budget. Sounds like both of those things would help everyone feel like they had a more solid foundation. Is that accurate?
Jennifer, definitely would help.
Yep, sounds good.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
All right, we will work on both of those items for sure. Yes, Robert, did you have any more thoughts, or anyone on the committee?
No, I just put some commentary in the chat. For those folks who are listening in from the public, I sent it to the organizers and the panelists, but it was basically to talk about four possible categories for consideration. I am very excited, though, about the dedicated email address that we set up for this group. And so we will be monitoring that on a regular basis. I think we're all committed to trying to take advantage of even that time that exists in between meetings to get as much feedback and information sharing done as possible to make these meetings more productive. We happened to finish, we almost had like an ad hoc subgroup meeting today with the additional hours that we had free. And so I thought that was pretty productive, and this was a lot of great feedback for us to consider. And I just, look forward to taking a look at those buckets and further prioritizing those for us to discuss internally and to determine how to support that.
Robert, can I just say, I literally just found where the chat box is on our screen. It's not readily apparent, so I don't know if everybody else is following it, and I was the only one. Can I just point out as an aside that of the three providers identified as members of the RRAG, only one is. So just a little correction on that.
I'm sorry, Laura, I missed that last part.
They're only one of the three providers listed as a RRAG member is actually an RRAG member. I don't know why the other two would self-identify that way.
Oh, got it. Got it.
I think to that point, we do want to make sure that the RA has an opportunity to see the results of the work that Hilltop's been doing and provide feedback. So there will be that opportunity for sure.
Great.
So we want to go to the next slide. Great. So we look forward to continue to work on prioritization, and hopefully we'll have some of this kind of foundational information you've requested together well in advance of the next meeting. And we can also have that more robust conversation to finalize subgroup plans at our next meeting on Thursday, February 9th from 10 to 12. Members of the public who would like to observe the meetings can register through the DDA training calendar at Constant Contact Events. Register once and get reminders for each meeting via GoToMeeting. Meeting connection links will be sent 1 day and 1 hour prior to the meeting. Meeting minutes will be made available following the meeting. If you have any questions regarding registration or would like to request accommodations, please contact Dr. Smalls. And can we go to the next slide, please? So here are the meeting dates for this rate review cycle. Please note the time change starting in April. And can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you again for attending, and we'll look forward to continuing our discussion on February 9th. And in the meantime, we will definitely be in touch with information that you've requested. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.